In 1965, Singapore was so poor, so small, and so unwanted that it was literally kicked out of its own country. The Prime Minister cried on national television. There was no natural resources, no land to farm, no army to protect it. Other nations gave it maybe 10 years before it collapsed. Today, Singapore has a higher GDP per capita than the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, and Japan. That is not a typo. And the way it happened should make you deeply uncomfortable about everything you think you know about why some places succeed and others do not. Because Singapore did not get lucky. It did not discover oil. It did not receive foreign aid that saved it. What it did was far more deliberate, far more ruthless, and far stranger than most people realize. And by the end of this, you will understand something about wealth and ambition that most people spend their entire lives never figuring out. But first, let's go back to that moment in 1965 when everything looked completely hopeless. Malaysia had just expelled Singapore from the Federation. The island had no clean water of its own. It was importing drinking water from the very country that just rejected it. Unemployment was around 30%. Racial tensions were explosive. The British military, which had been the backbone of the local economy, announced it was pulling out entirely. Lee Kuan Yew, the man who would become Singapore's founding father, looked at his tiny island of fewer than 2 million people and said something that almost no leader in history has had the courage to say out loud. He said, "We have nothing, so we have to become everything." What happened next is where the story gets interesting. Most developing nations, when they get independence, try to protect their own people by closing off from the outside world. They build walls around local industry. They distrust foreign companies. They try to be self-sufficient. Singapore did the exact opposite. Lee Kuan Yew flew to every major corporation in the world and essentially said, "Come here, build here, hire here, and we will make it easier for you to do business here than anywhere else on earth." He did not care where the money came from. He cared that it came. And here is the thing most people miss about that strategy. It only works if everything else around it is spotless. So Singapore built that spotlessness from scratch. Corruption, which is normal background noise in most developing economies, was treated as an existential threat. The government did not just make corruption illegal, it made it irrational. They raised civil servant salaries to levels that matched the private sector, removed the financial desperation that makes bribery tempting, and then made the punishment for corruption so severe that the risk never made sense. When the head of the National Anti-Corruption Bureau was himself found guilty of corruption, he was prosecuted. No exceptions. That sent a message that echoed across every boardroom in the world. Singapore means what it says. Now ask yourself this: when was the last time the place you live sent that kind of message to anyone? Because here is where it connects to something you might actually feel in your own life. Singapore's rise was not just about policy. It was about a particular relationship with reality. Lee Kuan Yew famously did not govern based on ideology. He governed based on what worked, even when what worked was uncomfortable, unpopular, or went against conventional wisdom. He studied what made cities great, what made economies grow, what made people feel safe enough to invest their futures somewhere, and then he built that thing, even when his own citizens initially pushed back. The city-state became obsessively clean, not just metaphorically. Littering carries real fines. Chewing gum was banned for years. Public housing was built on a scale that made home ownership accessible to over 80% of the population, which is higher than almost any Western country. And here is the retention piece that most documentaries on Singapore skip entirely. Singapore did not just attract foreign money. It attracted foreign talent, and then it made a brutal calculation that most democratic governments are terrified to make. It decided that being small meant you could not afford to waste human potential. So the education system became one of the most demanding in the world. Not because they wanted to stress out children, but because they understood that their only real resource was the intelligence and capability of their people. The results were staggering. Singapore's students began consistently ranking at or near the top of global education assessments. The workforce that emerged was not just literate, it was technically precise, multilingual, and disciplined in ways that made multinational companies genuinely want to be there rather than just tolerate being there. Then Singapore did something almost no other country has done at scale. It planned decades ahead. While most governments think in 4-year election cycles, Singapore's leadership made infrastructure and urban planning decisions based on what the city would need in 30 to 50 years. The port, the airport, the public transit system, the green spaces between skyscrapers that make the heat bearable, none of that happened by accident. Every square meter of that island was designed with intent. And now here is the part that actually changes how you see the world. Singapore is roughly the size of a large city. It has no mountains, no rivers worth mentioning, no oil, no farmland. It sits in a region historically defined by political instability and economic volatility. By every conventional measure, it should be a cautionary tale about the limits of small nations. Instead, it became the proof of something radical. That geography, resources, and historical advantage matter far less than the quality of decisions made by the people in charge and the culture those decisions create over time. Think about that for a second, because if the rise of Singapore proves anything, it is that the story you have been told about why some places are rich and others are not, the story about luck, about natural advantage, about who got there first, is incomplete, maybe dangerously incomplete. Singapore had none of the traditional ingredients for wealth. What it had was clarity about what it wanted, about what it was willing to do to get there, and about the fact that mediocrity was not an option when failure meant disappearing entirely. The uncomfortable question Singapore leaves behind is not how did they do it. It is why are so few others even trying? Because the blueprint is not a secret. It has been written about, studied, visited, and replicated in pieces across the world. The problem is never the blueprint. It is the willingness to hold yourself and your institutions to a standard that feels almost unreasonably high, day after day, decade after decade, without flinching when it gets hard. Singapore flinched at almost nothing. And that little island that the world once wrote off as too small, too poor, and too hopeless to matter is now the place that executives, entrepreneurs, and governments fly to when they want to understand what disciplined ambition actually looks like when it works. The next time someone tells you that where you start determines where you end up, remember an island with no water, no land, no resources, and no country that wanted it. And remember that 60 years later, the world was flying to it for lessons.